He woke up suddenly, in the darkness of the bathhouse and the stuffy smell of the extinguished hearth. He woke up and listened. He didn't sit up, but just raised his eyelids and slowly slid his hand to feel the hilt of the sword. The bathhouse had no windows, and the light coming in through the vents was too dim even when enhanced. He looked at the temperature distribution, but still felt that the cabin was empty. There was something outside. He unwrapped the liquid, silent movement and slipped off the platform where he had laid his bedding. Outside, the rain whispered softly and soothingly. Slow, heavy boot steps could be heard. The staff knocked. There was a faint sound of rubbing wet, frozen hand somewhere close. Somewhere nearby, he heard a soft breathing, through the nose, slow, but still every breath was a sound. A slight rustling of clothing. A squelch in the mud. He felt a tingling in his hand. Hyperadrenaline. He focused, slowing down the onset of acceleration. The process could be stopped, but it took a few seconds. The last thing he needed at the moment was to flutter around the bathhouse like a bat in a cage, upsetting everything around. Your only weapon is your brain, Levison had said. Not muscles, not a sword, but your brain. It won't be like in the movies. Many times you'll be surrounded or taken by surprise. You'll lose your weapon or won't have time to draw it. You'll experience the taste of panic, failure, and battle fatigue. Remember, it's those who stop thinking who mostly die. They gave up. They let their guard down. Never stop planning, even for a second. Everything is a weapon. A scream, a pretended fainting, a call for help, a spoon or a piece of cloth. Every survival is a triumph of improvisation. With a steady motion, he drew the sword from its sheath and looked at the triangular outlet of one of the vents. It was simply an unroofed space beneath the roof's peak, a bit too small for a person to fit. Outside, there was a splashing of mud. Someone stepped into a puddle. He looked around once more. The extinguished lamp. A pile of household items in the corner. The platform with disheveled bedding. The stone hearth. Everything could be a weapon. In the gap of the door, a narrow knife blade appeared, and it began to raise the rotating wooden latch ever so slightly. Just enough for it to clear the hook but not flip to the other side. Then, a slight push on the door was enough. The hinges made of leather straps shouldn't squeak. The intruder slipped inside, closing the door behind them. And then, they silently approached the platform where a huddled shape lay covered with a blanket. It was completely dark in the bathhouse, so the newcomer couldn't see Drakkainen above the door on the frame, flat against the wall. Vuko, on the other hand, could see just enough. He clenched the blade of the sword with his mouth, blade pointing outside, extended his hands in front of him, and fell flat on his face. It all happened in silence. Drakkainen found his hands on the ceiling beam, threw the body forward, landing on the floor with a single move. Then he reached under the intruder's armpit, gripping them by the throat and clamping the arteries on either side of the windpipe. He took the sword. He raised the attacker's knee, toppling them onto himself. The blade, facing downward, rested against the carotid artery. Now, only one move was enough. A short one. But the blade didn't move. "Now I'll let you go," Drakkainen whispered gently. "But if you try to scream, if I feel your belly tense up, I'll cut off your airway. You won't even have time to squeak." "My lady." He released her. The queen coughed for a while and cleared her throat, kneeling beside him with her head down. He picked up the knife that she had dropped. It was narrow and not very long. A stiletto. It would penetrate almost any clothing and reach deep but wouldn't leave many marks. Assassin's tool. She tried to say something and choked again. He picked up a cup of water and handed it to her. "He said you'd come. He said others would follow him. I recognized you right away. You don't have holy eyes like he did, but you look similar. Tall, with a strange face. I knew you're also a son of the gods." He sat and watched, as if he saw everything through and through. "I waited for you to come. And you came, bringing my son's hand." Drakkainen froze. It was the right time to ask one of the million questions that came to his mind, but he didn't know which one to choose. She unbuckled the clasp, and the fur that covered her fell to the ground. The queen raised her dress and lay on her back on the edge of the platform, spreading her legs wide. She extended her arms toward him. "Take me. You wanted to kill me. Ever since he left, every 9 months I've been giving birth, even though I'm not pregnant. They're afraid. The elder has them taken away secretly. To the forest. Into the cold fog, so they would die. But they come back. They go to their father. One day they'll avenge me and take me with them. I belong to him. I don't want this to end. Take me, I want to keep giving birth to the children of cold fog. One day the elder will kill me." All these years, she acted high and mighty, pretending to be the wise, until he came and showed her what she is in fact. What did Van Drakkainen do here? Drakkainen thought desperately. What a lovely situation. He wondered if many people in history who found themselves in a similar situation had time to scream before death, "My king, this is not what you think. You must repay me now. Give me the child you killed." "Did you have a child with Van Drakkainen?" "With whom?" "The songsinger with fish eyes." "Did he order you to kill me?" "I had many children with him. And I will continue to have them. With him and with you. His name was Aiken. Aiken. Hieronymus van Aiken, known as Bosch. And children of the cold fog. Born without pregnancy and taken to the forest." Right. The darkness of the bathhouse masked all these repugnant, small differences. The narrow wings of the nose. Eyes filled with darkness. Hair growing on the nape of the neck and at the top of the back, like a horse's manet. Elongated ears. And other details that made her seem inhuman. In the darkness, she was just like a woman. She had cold hands and wet feet. She smelled slightly of horse sweat, musk, and sour milk. Alien. Inhuman. He could take her. He realized he could also kill her if he felt like it. He could do practically anything that crossed his mind. Kill Grisma, take over in his place. Rule over the mad, deranged, drug-induced hallucinogenic fume-stricken mob. Or simply kill them all and move on. He had no law, no religion, nothing to answer to. He was alone here. He could do everything or nothing. Both possibilities were equally boring and led to nothing. A world of nihilism. He looked into her wide, dark eyes, her open mouth full of small teeth. The queen. He felt like laughing. How unprofessional. "Come," she gasped. Suddenly, a sound of commotion came from outside. The slamming of doors, the tramping of many feet, screams, something fell with a crash, and the dogs erupted into furious barking. They jumped apart. Drakkainen grabbed his pants, pulled on his boots haphazardly with straps and secured the helmet on his head. With one sword held between his teeth, he glanced at the queen, huddled on the platform, looking at him with wet eyes like a frightened rat. Outside, an angry, wailing roar reverberated through the doors. A prolonged, spine-chilling howl. The same as the one the prince had let out during their duel. "Mad scream," she whispered. Then her teeth were exposed in an insane smile. "My children are coming. You've summoned them. The cold fog is coming." Drakkainen looked at her, still holding the sword blade in his teeth, and slammed the door open. Outside chaos reigned. One could see warriors in helmets, but without trousers, or completely dressed, but unarmed. People ran in all directions without rhyme or reason, colliding with each other. Torches had been lit along the feast table, and now the space was bathed in flickering light, like from a fire. Wet torches spewed sparks and smoke. Someone knocked over a barrel, someone was shouting orders that no one was listening to. All to an ominous melody of a horn being blown somewhere. Drakkainen found an unpaved section of the courtyard and stuck his sword into the ground. He then inserted his fingers into the holes of a leather mitt attached to his bracer. "What a brothel," he mumbled indistinctly in Croatian while tugging on the straps with his teeth. He slapped the plates with his hand, drew the sword, and tucked it under his arm. In the middle of the night. And I had a date scheduled. With the queen no less, Pichku Materi. Someone rushed out from behind him. Vuko smacked the man's chest flatly, grabbed his mail coat, and pulled him close. What's going on? Where are you running to? The awakened, the man stammered, reeking of fermented beer. The awakened. Everyone here is already awake, you blockhead. Drakkainen snapped. He pushed the man against the bathhouse wall and headed toward the gate. A wild, warlike shout rang out again, chilling their blood. The warriors halted and fell silent for a moment. The prince stood in the rain with a sword and shield in hand. Half-naked, only wearing furry boots and pants. Drakkainen didn't recognize him at first because Grzędowicz had painted broad, black zigzags on his face and chest. He stood there now, emitting that eerie scream, which rang in their ears. The warriors responded to him in chorus like a pack of hyenas. I might have hit him a bit too hard, Drakkainen thought with concern. Grzędowicz, no, a girl screamed, her voice piercing, and she broke into heart-wrenching sobs. I'll stand on the ruins, the last man standing, the prince shouted. I won't retreat, and I won't cry. Let the world weep, let the enemies step back. Let the dead stand behind me. Let those who remain remember. Wake the god with a story about the last one alive. Weep, O hind, for he who didn't retreat. Here I come. The one who will replace the path. You won't pass. This seems to be some kind of ritual, Drakkainen thought. The others separated to let Grzędowicz through. The guard struggled with the latch of the small door in the middle of the gate, small doors as tall as a man, studded from the outside with iron spikes. They opened it slightly, and Grzędowicz squeezed through the gap and disappeared into the darkness. They crowded onto the platform of the gate tower to watch as the heroic son of the ruler would wash away the disgrace of the evening's defeat. They had laughed at him over dinner, and now they had tears in their eyes as he sacrificed himself in ultimate valor. He would stand there, driving away the hallucinatory apparitions, swinging his simple sword. He would pierce the fog and dispel the fumes. A true hero. Wanderer pushed his way through a tightly packed group of anxious warriors on the stairs and emerged on the deck above the gate from wet planks. Nothing was visible, not even the fog. Only Grzędowicz, standing in the darkness with his body painted in black zigzags, sharpening bundles of sparks with the edge of his shield. There's nothing there, Drakkainen said loudly. There are no monsters, those are just apparitions. The fog is poisonous. Burnt Wrath, standing next to him, grabbed his arm and, in silence, pointed to the headless guard lying on the platform, the same one Drakkainen had spoken to a few hours ago. Half of a carved spear protruded above the gate, but the monster's paws were missing. Vuko opened his mouth, but said nothing. First, a frightened herd of deer appeared. A male, a female, and 4 young ones. They ran out of the forest and headed toward the fort, completely ignoring Grzędowicz as if he didn't interest them at all. The fog suddenly engulfed the trees and invaded the clearing like a flood. It caught the fleeing animals, and before they disappeared, Drakkainen saw in astonishment that the leading stag suddenly disintegrated in a run into perfectly square slices, as if it had passed through a laser beam grid. He shook his head. There's nothing there, he repeated. Then he remembered the creature he had hacked. Fog or not, that creature was real and hellishly dangerous. Scratches on his skin still stung like ant bites. It became cold. Vuko looked through a thermal filter and saw, in front of Grzędowicz, who stood with his sword drawn, a column of fog thickening, with something misshapen, giant, and humanoid-like writhing within it, like an enraged mountain gorilla. Someone screamed. In regular sight the creature was a condensed darkness. A shaggy phantom with only red eyes shining and a palisade of mighty teeth. There's nothing there, Drakkainen said for the 3rd time. Look, it'll pass right through. He pulled a torch from its holder and hurled it straight at the creature. The blazing projectile somersaulted through the air and rebounded off the creature's chest, scattering sparks. The creature squatted a bit and emitted a thunderous, infrasound roar, almost at the threshold of audibility, making the air tremble. Drakkainen cursed, threw his sword to the outside of the palisade, and leaped over the barrier, trying not to impale himself on the sharpened end of the stakes. The acceleration fell upon him like a curtain, turning his descent into a dreamy glide, like parachuting down. He steadied his legs, tensed his muscles, rolled up his tongue, and clenched his teeth. From the platform to the ground, there were no more than 4.5 meters. He remembered that there were no stakes directly in front of the gate. The ground rose to meet him. He cushioned the fall with a roll over his shoulder and pulled his sword from the ground. He raised the weapon from the side of his head, looking at the raindrops sliding toward the ground, each gleaming like a diamond in the torchlight. In the slowed world of hyperadrenaline, the fog seemed as stiff as a curtain. Grismalfi's scream turned into the howl of a whale. The creature materialized suddenly and lunged forward like a hairy mountain. It resembled a cave bear, one that had mated with a yeti. A knotty paw with hooked claws whizzed past his head, tearing through the thickened air like a jet. He narrowly avoided it with a half-turn, dived through the creature's legs, and, rising on the other side, slashed twice where the tendons should be. The cry of pain sounded low and vibrating, making his diaphragm vibrate. The creature turned, thudded both huge fists on Drakkainen like a gorilla, sending fountains of muddy water flying, but Drakkainen was no longer there. The wet hilt clung perfectly to his hand, and the blade was sharp as a razor. Blessed be Nordland, the producer of the best swords in the universe. It's just an animal, Vuko thought. Large, but still just an animal. The massive head shot forward, the jaws snapped shut like a trap. In the air, sticky strands of saliva flew, hanging like threads. A heavy, almost mineral stench surrounded him. Drakkainen evaded with a half-turn and cut with one hand under the creature's massive jaws. At the throat. He watched as a pulsating stream of black blood spurted from the creature's neck, breaking into round drops. And then he got hit. Only when he fell after a long, foolish flight that seemed to go on forever in slow motion did he realize that something was wrong. Pain rushed through him in a long, numbing wave, and it stayed for good. You underestimated that beast, he scolded himself silently. You got complacent, you pompous fool. He tried to get up but fell back on the wet grass. He changed his position, but at that moment, the splayed paw, black as a leather glove, fell on his chest, pinning him to the ground. How stupid like that, Drakkainen thought. Those who die are those that stop thinking, Leveson said during training. The sword was too far away. He reached out, never taking his eyes off the creature's ugly, human-like face with a bearish muzzle. A pulsating stream gushed from the severed artery, but part of the blood slowly seeped into the fur and dripped on the wanderer's face. The sword was too far. Don't stop thinking. He threw his healthy leg over the arm that was pressing him down and applied a joint lock to the creature's elbow. He might as well have tried to break a bridge support. The creature's black devilish lips curled back, a drop of sticky saliva dropped from them, and Drakkainen, as if enchanted, watched as fangs appeared, and then the conical, partly exposed head, as large as a cheese wheel, fell on him, right on his head. The jaws snapped shut. On the bracer which Drakkainen defended with. The protector, beneath its titanium resembling surface, had a modified, 17-layer laminate, a honeycomb structure skeleton filled with pressed arachnid. He wondered about the creature's jaw pressure. The bracer creaked. Any moment now, it would crack, and Vuko's arm would splatter like a tomato. He reached out with his other hand and plunged it into the wound on the creature's neck, then found anything inside and pulled hard. The monster suddenly straightened up and lifted the paw-pinning wanderer to the ground, emitting a thunderous roar. It didn't move particularly fast. The crushing pressure slowly eased, the paw moved upward, and in the meantime, Drakkainen managed to lift his healthy leg, push himself away from the beast's torso, and slid backward on the wet grass, cutting his skin on some root. The sword laid in the grass, untouched. They passed themselves while lunging at each other. In slow motion, it seemed to Drakkainen that the monster trudged step by step like a buffalo, tearing up tufts of grass and splattering mud. He executed a difficult, awkward dodge, hopping on one leg, and slashed horizontally across the beast's belly. The monster fell forward drowsily, slowly, like a collapsing building, crashing to the ground with a thunder that made everything tremble. Muscles and fur rippled from the shock, muddy water sprayed upward, and sticks danced in the air. And then the drops fell normally, the sound of rain returned, and the warriors on the platform screamed. Drakkainen brushed the creature's head with the tip of his boot, knowing it was foolish, but nothing happened. Animal like animal. No awakened bullshit. You're quite ugly, Drakkainen muttered. Quite dissimilar to your father, I suppose. He sat for a while, breathing heavily. Not for long. Grzędowicz stood alone in front of the gate with his sword drawn, looking somehow pitiful and helpless. A dead silence fell over the platform. A terrible silence. Even the dogs fell silent. A tall, skinny creature in a black, wet cloak with a head resembling a rat's skull suddenly appeared before the young man. It held something that looked like a musical instrument, similar to a massive flute. It's not easy to run, limping on one leg, with a drawn sword. Especially after several minutes of acceleration. The creature standing in front of the gate raised the flute and blew, producing a sound that resembled a woman's scream. Terrifying, full of torment and fear, only longer than human lungs could produce. Drakkainen ran. A dreadful lament was hanging in the air, and Grzędowicz kept standing with his sword raised. And he was aging. He was aging with a crack. With a crunch resembling the sound of burning grass. His blue hair faded and turned silvery with grey, his skin wrinkled deeply, the sword trembled in increasingly spidery fingers, at the ends of which grew broken, yellowish nails, curling into hooks. Teeth fell out of his half-opened mouth, one after another, drawing threads of thick blood and saliva. Drakkainen ran, lifting his twisted leg in the air, limping and leaping. Even Grzędowicz's clothing was aging. In a second, it became stained, the metal fittings darkened, the embroidery unraveled into tattered threads. And above it all, there was an endless wail, like the cry of a tortured banshee. Vuko reached him and stopped in a crouched position, allowing his dislocated leg to barely touch the ground. Under the acceleration, the lament was a low, vibrating hum full of infrasounds. He didn't make it. Before the blade fell, slicing through the eerie musician's song, he suddenly stopped playing and disintegrated abruptly. It wasn't dust. The musician with a head resembling a rat's skull was disintegrating into moths. Plump ones, with shining metallic abdomens and wings like tiny, black capes. Hundreds of small insects flying into the night. The sword cut through the emptiness. Grzędowicz lay motionless on the ground, with faded, black eyes staring at the rainy sky. He didn't blink, despite the small raindrops falling directly into his pupils. He was as light as an empty shell. He resembled a snake's shed skin, but his facial features would be hard to recognize. He looked like a mummy. The fog dispersed. Only the rain remained. Vuko struck his helmet against the part of the gate without spikes and heard the grating of the latch from inside. They stepped aside in silence as he walked, limping, with the lifeless prince in his arms. He placed him on a table in the large hall next to the extinguished hearth. They watched as they followed him, standing against the walls as if they were afraid to approach. "This is your son, Grzma," Drakkainen shouted. His jaws pulsated. "He was supposed to rule after you, but he died to protect you. He died, piercing the fog with his spear. Standing against the storm. Thrusting his sword into the volcano. Cutting through the earthquake. So that you could say that you never backed down. His name was Grzędowicz Rainbird." He limped away from the table. The onlookers parted as he clumsily crawled outside. They watched in silence as he searched for something in the courtyard. Finally, he found a ladder and then entered the stable to retrieve an old harness. They stood around him, following his every move. They watched as he tied his leg with straps and secured it on the ladder rungs. For a while, he searched for the right position, and then he pulled with his entire body, with his leg caught between the rungs. There was a crunch, followed by a muffled wolf-like cry. The onlookers stepped back. Drakkainen, sitting down, untied the straps and massaged his ankle, moving his foot in all directions. Then he put on his boot and returned to the hall, pushing away those who didn't manage to step back in time. He found a piece of meat with some flesh still on it, a dried cheese lump, and some nibbled onions. He gathered them along with a flask of cucumbers. No one said a word. Not even Grzma. Then Drakkainen pushed the remnants of food away from him, stood up, and left the hall. They stood in the courtyard when he entered the bathhouse and slammed the door behind him. They could hear him securing it from the inside. The clan of the Mad Scream stood in the courtyard and watched the bathhouse. It was raining. In the morning, the rain stopped, but they continued to stand, silently and helplessly. Finally, they began to disperse gradually. One needs to continue living in the end, despite all. They opened the gate, and the shepherds led out the cows and goats. Some movement began. Smoke began to seep from the thatched roofs of the cottages. Only from the courtyard could one hear the wailing of women and the voice of the wisest drumming. The prince was about to embark on a long journey. Someone harnessed an ox to the dismembered monster's corpse and pulled a piece away from the settlement. The wisest and bravest warriors went there with horns of beer in their hands, to stab the creature with spears, gawk, and exchange expert opinions. Late in the morning, the bathhouse doors opened and Drakkainen appeared. He limped a bit on one leg but walked confidently, laden with bags and a bag, in full armor, with a saddle on his shoulder. He still had a stony face and remained silent. Grisma blocked his way. "My son died last night," he announced. "I saw," Drakkainen growled. "He died so that you would stay with us. You owe me this," Grisma began, but he saw Vuko's expression and cut it short. Vuk threw the saddle on the ground and quickly, in a snake-like motion, drew his sword. Just a bit, by 5 fingers, but Grisma jumped back abruptly. The others also retreated. "Try to stop me, King," Drakkainen said in a quiet, terrifying voice. "And I promise you that by noon today, there will be no clan of the Mad Scream left." Grisma remained silent. Nitsefni sheathed his sword and slung the saddle over his shoulder. He walked along the stream, without looking back, and no one stopped him. They said that the mist followed him.